welcome to GradCast, the official radio show and podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at Western University. Today, I'll be your producer, Gavin Tolometti, and I'll be joined with hosts Yimin, Chen, and Yousuf Hasan. We have a special virtual Western Research Forum, 3 parts for you today, and this will be part 1, featuring guests Navid Gill, Jacqueline Seagull, Kimberly Adamek, and Marzia Sadiji. They unfortunately were not able to present at this year's Western Research Forum due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Without further ado, let's get on to the first guest.
Okay, hello. Welcome to GradCast's online coverage of the Western Research Forum, which didn't really happen this year. My name is Yimin Chen. I'll be one of your hosts today, and I'm joined with my co-host.
And I'm your co-host, Yousuf, and today we are here with Navjot Jill. So welcome to our show.
Thank you.
So tell us about your background and how you came to be interested in the research you've recently done.
So my background is in physical therapy. So I have an undergrad degree in physiotherapy, and from there working with seniors in long-term care, I just kind of came across this idea of how much easier it is on the health, like less burden on healthcare if we have people living in the community as compared to transitioning into long-term care. And this was just like a very little idea that just kind of floated around. And then I got in touch for a master's with my current supervisor. She does research in the field of aging, and from there, this idea just kind of built up of how to possibly look into factors which influence health-seeking behavior of older adults and how that could potentially affect their aging in place in the long run.
Okay, and so what program are you doing your master's in?
So I am in the Health and Rehabilitation Sciences program in the field of physical therapy, and it's my 2nd year.
Okay.
So just wrapping it up and hoping to defend by the end of next month.
All right, fingers crossed.
Yes.
So Navjot, tell us could you elaborate a bit more on what you mean by health-seeking behaviors, especially as it pertains to older adults? And also, how does that relate to wellness or well-being dimensions?
Okay, so basically health-seeking behavior when it comes to older adults, or in general, it just means that the action that you take reflecting that, yes, I may have an illness or this potentially poses as a threat to my health, taking those steps to reach out to healthcare services, community support services, to take action before that illness actually manifests itself and becomes something that is kind of out of your control, especially as an older adult when there are so many other chronic conditions that are underlying. And in terms of this correlating to well-being and dimensions of wellness, so that was the whole point of our study, was to kind of see if health-seeking behavior does have any relation with dimensions of wellness, because dimensions of wellness potentially are 6 to 7 dimensions which are interdependent, and through their interdependent and interlinking, it leads to a healthy living, or in terms of older adults, it possibly leads to aging in a healthy manner. So we wanted to see if health-seeking behavior could possibly be influenced by these factors, and if there was some link between them. Unfortunately, our results didn't yield much in terms of this. We were able to find that if older adults are more aware of their community support services, they do have better health-seeking behavior. But unfortunately, the study did not reveal any connection between dimensions of wellness and health-seeking behavior in older adults.
I was just wondering, so perhaps it didn't reveal exactly what you were hoping for right now, but in doing or conducting the study, did it reveal something that would still help you to, or guide you to conduct some other kinds of researches to get to what you really desire?
So that's actually a really good question, and that is something that came up when we were reviewing the literature. Even recent reviews in 2017 throughout 2019, they show that wellness and health-seeking behavior itself is a very complex construct. So it's very difficult to dismantle it. There's so many factors that interplay. So we're hoping that our research, even though it didn't necessarily tell that it is effective, it did kind of clear out the mud a little bit, if that's does make sense to kind of like, okay, yeah, so these are not the factors. Is there any other way, any other combinations of these factors which could potentially help us understand health-seeking behavior relatively more than previous literature shows?
Thank you.
Cool. So you mentioned you were looking at dimensions of wellness in this study, and unfortunately didn't find a lot of connection there. Can you tell us a little bit about like what these dimensions are and why did you think going into it that it might be connected to health-seeking behavior?
So dimensions of wellness, the model that we're using is proposed by the International Council of Active Aging. So it consists of 7 dimensions. There's social well-being, spiritual well-being, physical, vocational, intellectual, and environmental. Sorry, I went over that way too fast. But yeah, there are these 7 dimensions.
Okay.
For our study, we could not include vocation and intellectual because for our study, we needed participants who were intellectually or cognitively intact. And for vocation, we were recruiting 65 years and older. So we were recruiting from centers like community centers, senior centers. So it was kind of given that they would be retired or either working as a volunteer. So the other 5 dimensions that are left. So for the first one is physical. So it says that in order for you to have like age successfully, which you need to have a good physical component, like you should be physically well. So for that, we decided to look at their physical functions and we found a very specific outcome measure and we measured their physical function. The second dimension that we looked at was environment. For environment, we decided to focus on fall risk, which basically is situated within your environment. For that, again, this study, just to kind of, is strictly quantitative, so there was no qualitative data collected. The third one that we used was spirituality and social well-being, and the last one was resilience. So these were our 5 factors which we had rooted in the 7 dimensions of wellness. And just to kind of add on top, we added awareness of community sports services. So we just felt like, for example, I'll give you an example with physical function. What we hypothesized was that if someone feels their physical function is declining, then they would go out and have a better health-seeking behavior because they realize, okay, yes, my physical function is declining. I need help from specific health services. But unfortunately, that was not the case. That is not what our findings revealed. So this is how we were hoping to link all these dimensions with health-seeking behavior. For example, for environmental, if they felt that, yes, I am at risk of falling now that I'm growing older, my physical function is declining, we hypothesized that they would reach out to community support services to assist them in rearranging their home, making sure there are no risks to them falling. But again, nothing was revealed within the study. So on and so forth. This is how we hypothesized that the dimensions would be related to health-seeking behavior. But like I have mentioned before, we did not find any specific correlation except for awareness of community support services, which did show that as an older adult, if you are aware that these services exist, you would have better health-seeking behavior, which is I guess that is kind of a given that if you know these services exist, you are more likely to go out and reach out to them and use them.
So am I correct in understanding that in your study, you found that even for the older adults who are aware of some perhaps deficiencies or issues in some of these other dimensions, even if they knew that there were some issues there, they did not then go and seek help or assistance or other services that way?
They believed that, so we couldn't interpret it at such a minute level. It was more so just seeing their function overall and then comparing it from the scores we got for health-seeking behavior. So that was a questionnaire itself. And we ran a multiple regression with health-seeking behavior as a dependent variable. And from that, this is what we assume, that even if they feel like their physical function is low, they won't necessarily feel that it's necessary for them to go out and look for services to assist them with that.
Right, and so the only thing that seemed to have a connection was how aware they were of the services available.
Yep, so the more aware they were of the community support services available in the city of London, the better their health-seeking behavior score was. So there was a strong positive correlation between these two.
Okay, so then does your study suggest, or could you potentially interpret those results as perhaps a need to highlight the importance of awareness of these sorts of services?
Mhm. Yep, studies even conducted within Canadian populations do show that older adults are not that aware of community sports services. And there are various underlying factors for this, like they don't feel the need to know, they depend on their family and friends. Sometimes our healthcare system is so, it's not that interconnected. It's very difficult for them to navigate the healthcare system. So they don't even reach to that point where they want to get out there and be bothered. I put that in air quotes because that's how they mentioned it, that they don't even want to bother going out there. And even when I was chatting with the participants while they were filling out the form, some of them did say, oh, well, you know, my friend had an experience where they had a PSW come home and then this happened. And like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. And I will never, ever reach out to community sports services. So there is a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of understanding why there is such a lack of awareness. And there are also studies which are focusing on how healthcare providers can actually facilitate linkages of older adults to community sports services. So yes, there is a lot that needs to still be done in terms of raising awareness for older adults and the community sports services available.
I was wondering, so what led you to, or what motivated you to extend the well-being dimensions to include in the first place the community support services awareness or accessibility? And that is a really interesting dimension as you put it as well. What are the sort of difficulties that older adults actually face in actually not only knowing that such facilities or services exist, but also that they're easily accessible and there are not too much difficulties to actually get that help?
So we just added this on top because there's a lot of literature that shows that older adults prefer to stay in their own homes for as long as possible because it has a meaning to them. It is very, you ask any older adults and their first reaction would be, look, no, I do not want to move into a long-term care, yet we still have a fragment of population, I think around 11% of older adults over the age of 85, which are transitioning into long-term care. So and then there's all this literature which shows that there's so many community sports services available. Within the City of London, we were able to come up with 78 community sports services. And this is just the top of the iceberg. There's so many of them available. But the literature shows a disconnect between the availability and the use of community sports services. So this is what kind of triggered us. Like we were trying to understand that why, despite their desire to age in place, they're not using these services. And then going on to your question about what other difficulties older adults face, like I mentioned, older adults, first of all, sometimes they're not aware. Second, they usually rely on family and friends, and this kind of becomes difficult for older adults who do not have that kind of social support around them, who can guide them in the right direction. Then most of our databases are now that are coming up in Ontario are relatively online databases. So like 211helpline.ca, seniors info, these all are online. And there is this thing where technology does become a bit of a barrier, especially for older adults to navigate. And then adults who do make it up to that point where they're reaching out to community sports services, they feel like they say that the treatment or the services they're getting is very cookie cutter in nature, meaning that they do not take them as a person into consideration. It's more so, okay, well, this happened with that other person, so these are the services we're going to provide to you. They do not understand that not every person has the same situation. There are differences that need to be considered. So yeah, these were the couple of issues that come up when accessing community sports services.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you for taking the time to share some of your research with us today.
No, thank you so much for
Thanks
having
a lot.
me. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, that was Navjot Gill. She was a master's student in health and rehabilitation sciences, graduating quite soon. So all the best of luck to you there, Navjot.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for continuing to join us as GradCast covers the now canceled Western Research Forum online. My name is Yimin Chen, and I am joined today by my co-host.
I'm your co-host Yousuf, and today we are here with Jacqueline Siegel. Jacqueline, we are interested to know how you came to be interested in the current project in social psychology, since you were first doing feminist identity or studying feminist identity.
Yeah, so feminist identity is inherently tied to body image. There are a number of both feminist scholars, feminist researchers, people who do feminist work, all of the feministy things link back to the ways that women see their bodies, in some degree at least, because we need to start our feminist activism kind of within ourselves. As Gloria Steinem says, it's a revolution from within. And so I'm interested in particular in the ways that sociocultural pressures and expectations on people based on their gender influence the way that they perceive and kind of interact with their bodies.
Okay.
Thank you.
And so the piece that you had submitted to the Western Research Forum, the title was A Validation of a Phenomenological Measure of Body Shame. Could you just briefly explain what does phenomenological mean?
Yeah, so phenomenological means embodied or how it is felt, lived, and experienced. So
Okay.
oftentimes when we talk about shame in particular, or when we measure shame, we look at hypothetical kind of situations, or in general, how do you do this? But we don't really capture what it feels like in your body to experience shame, because emotions are kind of hard to measure and report on. So we tried to do this in a kind of novel way, and we did it. We validated it, I promise.
Okay. Well, I mean, can you expand on these ideas of body shame a little bit? Like, what kinds of things were you interested in going into this study?
Yeah. So shame is a self-conscious emotion. It kind of forms this conglomeration of self-conscious emotions. It's a part of embarrassment, guilt, shame, and pride, all of which are emotions that appear in response to other emotions or in response to other sensations or experiences.
Okay.
So shame is unique in that it particularly refers to a sense of having not met a personal expectation or goal. So let's say that you think that you are supposed to look a certain way and then you feel like you don't. You may experience the phenomenon of shame about your body. So I am interested in that in particular because shame is implicated as an outcome of objectification and sexual objectification for women's bodies in particular. So what objectification theory suggests is that sexual objectification of women's bodies becomes internalized, and then that can result in shame, which can have downstream consequences on women's disordered eating, sexual attitudes, and depression down the road. But I wanted to specifically isolate and hone the phenomenon of shame because basically the way that we study it in my field doesn't actually capture what shame feels like.
Okay.
So that's where this set of studies came in.
So I was wondering that when you were studying shame, you must have seen some positive aspects of using shame as a tool in some other areas. For example, if you look at Greta Thunberg talking about climate issues, that kind of shame is actually useful to create some sort of awareness when it comes to climate concerns. But of course, that's not true when it comes to body shaming. So could you tell us what is maybe unique to body shaming and why it would be important for us to understand this phenomenon of body shaming?
Sure. So I think it's important that we parse apart body shaming, like the act of shaming someone for their body, and the phenomenon of feeling ashamed about your body. So research consistently suggests that shaming people for their bodies is a bad move. Being teased for your body does not help your body image. It doesn't change your behaviors. It actually is associated with increased disordered eating and also weight gain. Don't shame people for their bodies for any reason. I myself am a survivor of a very pernicious eating disorder that I actually had to leave school for. Some of that is due to body shaming. Don't body shame people. That is my message. If you listen to nothing else about this, don't body shame people.
That's good advice.
It's important for us to understand the phenomenon of shame and how individual people feel about their bodies because it's implicated in disordered eating, body dysmorphia, the experience of gender dysphoria. Shame about our bodies has a host of negative ramifications for people who feel it.
So how did you go about then trying to understand and measure this feeling of shame?
I will not take credit for the original scale. We did not develop the scale, we just validated it. So the original scale was used in a 1998 paper from the original objectification theory researchers. And what they did in that study was they had people, it's Barbara Fredrickson and colleagues, they had people come into the lab and stand in front of a mirror wearing either a swimsuit or a sweater. And then they reported their experience of shame after having been in either a sexually objectifying environment or not. And what they found was that people who were in the sexually objectifying environment or who wore a swimsuit in front of the mirror reported higher levels of body shame. And that's what that study is pretty widely known about. They've replicated it in men. It's kind of a classic in the field. But the scale that they used in that study, which was the Phenomenological body shame scale, had never actually undergone any sort of tests of construct validation. And construct validation is important in our field because without knowing the psychometric properties of the scale, it's impossible to tell precisely what it is that we're measuring. So we wanted to go through the construct validation process with the scale to show that it is both a valid and reliable measure.
Right. So, Jacqueline, despite the detrimental effects of body shaming, we seem to have these social structures that actually allow for this shaming to continue in ways that are extremely harmful. Why is that the case that we aren't able to fix those structures, or even as individuals stop indulging in this sort of harmful practices that cause additional anxiety for people and so forth?
Yeah, so there are two explanations that I think are equally valid and appropriate to discuss when we're talking about body shame. The first of which is sexism, and the second of which is kind of weightism, or the conflation of weight and health. So when we talk about sexism, sexism being discrimination and prejudice and stigma against people on the basis of their gender, just putting it out there so that we all have common definition, we can see that sexism is kind of braided into the fabric of our society. The way that we treat women's bodies, we anticipate and we expect and we almost demand that they are beautiful and thin and sexually pleasing to look at. And so women can internalize that and feel that they're not meeting impossible expectations. So it's very difficult to stop kind of feeling ashamed of your body when every message that's coming at you is basically telling you that you should feel ashamed of your body because you're never going to live up to these standards. So I think that part of it is sexism that's woven into our society, and this isn't even something that we get into in the paper because we need to tailor our papers to the journals that we're submitting them to, and attacking research from two different social issues might be overload for the science community. But something that's important to discuss is the way that we use shame as a tool to motivate weight loss, and the conflation of having a larger or not slim body and being in poor health, which is an erroneous correlation. There are people of all different body sizes who have all different health levels, and yet we as a society tend to look at people in larger bodies and say, oh, that's something that needs to be changed. You need to do something about your body. So I think it's hard to stop internalizing and feeling those things because they're everywhere. We see fat shame all over the internet. We see it in commercials, we see it in magazines, and we also see the sexual objectification of women's bodies in all of those places as well. And this isn't to suggest that men and gender minority people don't experience body shame. We know that they do, but it's just a different and gendered phenomenon that we see more intensely in women.
I guess that's why your main focus was for this, for women, body shaming involved with women, actually.
Yeah, and we do have some studies that we're looking at down the line. So we did 3 studies for this particular paper, but we do have a study that's coming up that's looking at how it is that phenomenological body shame is experienced differently for people of different gender identities. However, research is kind of stalled right now.
All right. So, now that you've have some support, some evidence for validating these measurements in this scientific setting, what can we do with these measurements? How is that going to help perhaps future research designs, future investigation into some of these very important issues?
Yeah. So the phenomenon, well, not the phenomenon, but the experience of shame and the study of shame is kind of ongoing. It's got a very rich tradition. There's a number of correlates that have already been identified. By looking at shame, we can say people who experience body shame also experience, reduced sexual satisfaction, reduced orgasm functioning, more self-harm, lots of these things. However, now we can test these in a more valid and reliable measure of shame. Also, we can look at the way that phenomenological, specifically lived body shame, influences people's eating and kind of all these different well-being behaviors. What's neat about this particular scale is that it kind of blends state and trait level experiences of shame, because the instructions encourage people to imagine that they're standing in front of a mirror and how it is that they're feeling in that particular moment, which looks at something like a state level. So it could be used in manipulations involving body shame and experiments looking at body shame, but you can also use it as a trait level variable. So we just think that it has a lot of utility, and it really enhances the way that we study body shame. That's our main goal, to continue this legacy of studying body shame. And I think that future directions, we absolutely need to look at the way that body shame is implicated in men and in people of different sexual and gender minorities, because as we kind of talked about before this formal interview started, a lot of the research that is being done is on white women, and we know that we need to expand that out a little bit more.
Right. Well, Jacqueline, I was wondering, given the unprecedented times, COVID-19, how do you think it might impact your research, and further, maybe you might have some other sub-projects as well? Are you working on something else as well, given the situation?
Actually, I hadn't even planned on talking about this, because I just forgot that we had used the scale in another project, but I'm working with Dr. Virginia Ramsier-Winter at the University of Missouri in the Center for Body Image Research and Policy. And we use the scale to examine how people's kind of changed eating patterns as a result of COVID-19 influence their body shame. And what we found was that people who are stressed out about the pandemic are experiencing higher levels of body shame and engaging in more disordered eating behaviors. So we're already seeing applications of the scale moving forward. So we're trying our best to use this scale for good, so that we can look at how stress responses can influence people's experiences of body shame and what the results of that are downstream. But we're also trying not to exploit people for the sake of, advancing research. It's a complicated balance, because you hate to be the person that kind of looks at this as a research opportunity rather than a tragedy, but also got to get that degree. So we do it. We make sacrifices.
Right. So Jacqueline, now that we are more aware about, the negative aspects of shame, especially body shame and these sorts of things, do you have any advice for us or for our listeners? What we might be able to do, or things we might be able to think about in order to try to break this cycle of societal shaming?
Well, got it. So societal level shaming or individual kind of feeling better about yourself?
So
Oh,
Try
sorry.
not to shame people.
Sorry, you shorted out. I didn't hear the question.
Oh, sorry. So I guess what I was asking is, are there things I can do to sort of make sure I don't participate in the shaming of people, or even sort of unconsciously?
Yes, absolutely. So in general, it's a good move to not talk about people's appearance. Of course, don't shame people for the way that their body looks, whether it's for their size, whether it's for their skin tone, whether it's for their different levels of abilities. Just like don't talk about the way that people look. In general, that's kind of a good move. People are very interesting regardless of what they look like, and what you look like is kind of the least interesting thing about you. And we tend to think, okay, well, as long as I'm not insulting someone, it's not that big of a deal. But you never know how those comments are going to affect people. So something that I want to talk about two particular points. The first of which is even positively valenced comments about people's bodies have been shown to result in increased body dissatisfaction in people. So because it calls attention to the way that your body appears, it can actually make you self-conscious. So if you look at someone and you're like, oh my goodness, wow, you look smoking hot, that could actually be sexually objectifying whether or not you recognize it. But in the same vein, complimenting people on losing weight or, in some cases on gaining weight can also influence the way that people feel about their bodies. Because, I've just, even anecdotally, I've been at different weights throughout my life. And there have been times when I've been really struggling with my eating disorder. And people have been like, oh my goodness, look at you, you're losing so much weight. Good for you. And I'm like, I'm in treatment 4 days a week, but don't worry about it. So you never know what people are going through when you make those sorts of comments. Another way is just don't comment on the types of foods that people are eating. Just kind of leave people's bodies out of the conversation so that you don't inadvertently even say something that could make someone feel ashamed about their bodies. And sometimes we think about fat jokes and kind of diet talk around other people. We talk about the ways that we're treating our bodies in sometimes unhealthful ways. We might say something like, I'm going on a cleanse and it's gonna, I'm gonna lose 14 pounds in 7 seconds. And that can be kind of triggering and make people feel bad about the way that they're treating their bodies. So just talk about other stuff. There's so much other stuff to talk about that's not your body. So just don't do that.
Okay, Jacqueline, thank you very much for sharing your research with us and for that advice.
Thanks for having me on here. Happy to talk to you anytime.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
So Jacqueline Siegel is completing her PhD in social psychology, and she joined us at GradCast here online of the Western Research Forum since it's canceled. Thanks for being with us. I'm Yimin, and my co-host today was Yousuf. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Hello, everybody. I'm back again with our online coverage of the Western Research Forum. My name is Yimin Chen. I'll be one of your hosts today, and I am joined with my good friend, Yousuf. Hello.
Well, hi, I'm Yousuf. I'm your co-host, and today we have Kim Adamek here as well to tell us, well, how she was got interested in wind engineering and what her current project is about. So welcome, Kim.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. It's nice that you guys did this, especially since the forum was canceled. So that's nice. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great. I think you're the first wind engineer we've had on the show. Can you tell us a little bit more about what does that mean?
All right. So wind engineering, obviously wind impacts a lot of different things. Most notably, we kind of only really think of wind when it's extreme. So with tornadoes, hurricanes, or the opposite end of the spectrum is like wind energy. So wind turbines. I do none of that research. So those are all there's a lot of topics. there's also wind, how it impacts like buildings, like how they move, wind in terms of like air pollution, natural ventilation, pretty much how it interacts with buildings and then how that interacts with us. So that's kind of where I focus on, but it is a very, very broad topic because we're obviously always surrounded by air and wind, and it, you know, runs the whole world. It connects us all. So that's kind of a brief description of it.
Wow, very cool. So then your research interests, did you say specifically, are is in the area of how wind interacts with cities?
Yes. So my background is actually I did my undergrad and my master's in architecture.
Okay.
So within architecture, we look at how, you know, to design buildings and spaces that not only work, but they like make a comfortable and safe space for people. So the building and how you move through it functions like the way that you live. So on a site visit, I saw how actually like when new buildings were built, it changed the wind around a certain site. And I started to wonder like, oh, like, is there a way we could have kind of anticipated that, or especially like if you want it, you only really notice wind when it's bad, like when it kind of disrupts your life. So when you want to have a patio in a certain space, or when you're trying to walk and you can't, like in extreme areas. So then I came to find wind engineering, obviously, which is like the science aspect of how it actually works and functions. So yeah, so that then I learned how buildings, when they interact with the wind and the wind interacts with the building, you actually change the whole flow, which is kind of cool.
Right. And so in your abstract, you mentioned that, you know, there was a problem of maybe really fast winds and it wasn't so helpful or good for the pedestrians that were there. So in effect, the buildings really helped in slowing down the wind. Of course, this led to a new problem. So tell us about this new problem and how your research might be helpful in terms of having designs that can take care of this new problem as well.
Yeah, so in the last few years, we were seeing with tall buildings, they were redirecting high-speed winds down to the ground, which was like blowing people off their feet, making areas like inaccessible, things like that. So that became like the new issue with taller buildings. But then what actually happens with a lot of wind tests is that we're only really looking at like one problem and to solve one problem. But because, as I was saying, that like wind impacts a lot of things like ventilations, pollutants. If we layer not just looking at high speed winds at street in terms of blowing people over, but also how that wind can blow and take out pollutants in the air, we're noticing that, okay, if there's low wind speeds and then a lot of pollutants are coming out of, like, if there's a parking lot, so exhaust from cars or exhaust from buildings, that actually can create areas of like really, really high pollutant concentration. So you have really poor air quality. Obviously, if a lot of people aren't going in that area, it's not going to be that big of a problem. So you have to take all this information and layer it. So where are people walking? Where do you want the winds to be slower? But then also if exhaust, like pollutants are being exhausted in that same area, you have to kind of find a balance between what's good enough to bring those pollutants out of the city, but also not too much wind that it's making people uncomfortable and unsafe, like in unsafe conditions.
So are you trying to find kind of like the sweet spot of how much wind is just right for our cities?
Yes. So there's definitely a mix between, because obviously if you plan a city with certain areas that maybe those are pedestrian areas, or so there's obviously different ways of dealing with this problem. But from our point of view, we're trying to find, yes, the sweet spot where how much wind do we need? And how can we, use it to our benefit if we realize that buildings are in fact like impacting how it moves.
I was wondering how aware are people about this issue that building designs cause in terms of having more pollution, for example? And do people really put in the effort in the design by investing? I suppose it sometimes might be more expensive to construct those buildings with the particular design you may have in mind, and they might be like somewhat reluctant, and they might just say, "Oh, it's okay. A bit of pollution is okay," and not really take care about it. I guess I was thinking about this in terms of how people often are reluctant to even take care of making buildings accessible for people, and that is a huge problem. So of course they might be also reluctant in this way as well. So could you tell us what you have seen and what you think we can do to sort of create better awareness about the situation?
So one of the hardest things with getting wind or other like climatic parameters incorporated in buildings is that you can't see the wind. So it's definitely like one of the hardest things to convince people matters unless there's a problem. But that being said, obviously we've seen a shift with like the emphasis on climate change and how much buildings actually, like the building sector contributes overall to climate change in general and greenhouse gas emissions. So people are starting to, well, let's say governments are starting to implement like building codes and different kind of requirements for people to actually study the wind. And there are like wind engineering companies that specialize in studying certain buildings and what their impacts are. But what happens a lot of the time is, say you've designed one building shape and it's a circle, and you get it, maybe you get a circle and then a square studied, and then you kind of find out the best option, you come back, but say later on within the design process, something changes, like very rarely, unless it's significant, does it come back to get tested again because it is so expensive. So I think having a little bit more knowledge on the design side would help people be more prepared when they're going to get things tested, so that the building actually functions as it should and it's doing what you want it to when you're designing it, and then follow that through to when it's being built.
Thank you.
So I'm kind of curious, how do you study this sort of thing? Like, what does your research look like in sort of more practical terms?
That's a great question. A lot of times, well, so we have something, especially at Western University, the Boundary Layer Wind Tunnel. It was one of the kind of first tunnels in the world to actually study buildings, because building wind tunnels are much different than wind tunnels for airplanes, because the wind, as it nears the surface of the earth, starts to slow down, so you get more turbulence. So that's like, just more complicated wind, let's say. It's not straight. We technically scale the buildings down, so we make them smaller, and then in the wind tunnel you have like little probes that measure actually the pressure of the wind, so like when air is changing over these kind of sensors, and then you can visualize that on a computer, right, taking all that data, processing it. But within the last decade or so, obviously people have been working on also using computational fluid dynamic simulations. Obviously, there's always debate about if you can actually rely on it, but you can use the wind tunnel. So the thing that everyone agrees works and can actually accurately analyze the wind. So take that and then use it to validate the simulations you're doing. So to prove that you can actually do a lot more, if you want, like, say, like 20 building shapes, even 100 building shapes, you can do it much faster than having to physically build it in a wind tunnel, right, on the computer. And these days, the computer is actually like much more accessible, obviously, than getting a wind tunnel. So at least in initial design phases, being able to test, like do these simulations on computers, and at Western we have also like SharkNet, the supercomputers, so those also help us process like much more data faster, and then we can go to the wind tunnel, which is extremely reliable, to either validate or to do like a final test on it.
So
sounds cool.
So Kim, tell us about, I was wondering, what are the kinds of difficulties that you might face in implementing some of the really beneficial designs that you may have in mind?
Well, the difficulty is definitely in, so every project, any building you place anywhere on the world is very specific to where it is. So wind is almost always a case-by-case basis, like how the wind is interacting with your building. say, and every kind of aspect of your building shape or how close it is to other buildings changes how the wind is. So the thing that we're trying to create is like a framework to relate these different topics. So air quality, like ventilation, PLW, but also through different scales. So like, what an earlier study that we did found that if you have like a new building built, say like right where I am, areas like even blocks away their winds can actually change even further away. So you have like a large impact. So we're trying to make a framework to at least give people a sense of like how wide or how small does one building, like what is its general impact, so that when you're going into designing a building, you at least have in your periphery like all the things you kind of need to consider when you go in. But that is obviously overwhelming. But at least to have the idea, so not to just unconsciously design things without knowing what you may possibly impact. That's kind of what we're hoping to help with, so that we're not just unconsciously changing things.
Great.
So Kim, in the abstract that you had submitted to the Western Research Forum,
Yeah.
you used the metaphor of the city as an organism. I think that's a really compelling image, but would you be able to explain that a little bit for us?
We found this like kind of the easiest way to explain how wind connects like every building, or like the city is made up of obviously these multiple layers, not just these different wind topics. So you have, how sun accesses it, how people move around, how the building structures are, what programs these buildings are, right? Like how society actually functions. You have cultural, like environmental, all these different parameters. So within like a human body, you have obviously these different systems, your skeletal system, circulatory system, respiratory system, your skin. They all come together to form, like they're dependent on one another to create like one form. And so the city is the same thing. It's made up of like different elements and different buildings that play a role in the overall body of what is the city. And so we are trying to use this metaphor to really kind of drive home that when you build a building, it's not isolated. It doesn't exist on its own. It doesn't only impact itself. Once it's input into like the DNA of the city, its impact is wide. So everything starts to talk to one another, and they're all connected in multiple ways. The easiest we see is like, when you build a building and it maybe blocks the sun from another, but we were trying to emphasize that actually is changing also the wind, even if you don't see it.
Wow. I think we're running out of time, but I just have a small question. Are you working on some other projects that are linked to or related to the current project you're working on? Have you thought of some other issues? Could you just briefly say something about it?
So we are, like my team, with my supervisors, Dr. Garma Bitsamlak, we're working on COVID-related projects looking at.
Great.
Obviously it's really important. I've never really worried about the air like I do these days. I'm sure a lot of people are feeling kind of very similar about that. Like how close am I to when people are walking near me, like how far. So we're looking at, and some studies have been published by other researchers on like how far you actually are. Like if you sneeze and you don't cover your mouth, like how far does that actually go? When you don't look at wind, it goes maybe like 1 meter, 2 meters away. So once you actually add wind into consideration, it actually changes how far you really need to be or where you can be in proximity, right? Because if the wind is blowing at you, you sneeze, imagine if you're behind that person. It actually changes your whole understanding of where you should be in terms of like a person's like mouth and the water droplets that are coming out. But we're just kind of obviously in the initial stages of looking at that. But even people were saying that kids were going to go back to school and that they would sit 2 meters apart. So also like interior ventilation, like how the air is moving through the room would also really impact like how, just in the same way that I think that air connects us, it can also be kind of dangerous. So we're just looking at it's very preliminary, but like how that connection, how we can be just more aware of that connection in like typical building design.
Great.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, thank you, Kim, for making us more aware of the air we're in,
Yes.
and for blowing us away with your fascinating research. I can't take credit for that joke. That was inspired by our producer, Gavin Tolometti. So thank you for that.
Yes.
But yeah, we have been speaking with Kimberly Adamek, who is a PhD student in studying wind engineering. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, welcome again to GradCast coverage of the now canceled Western Research Forum. My name is Yimin Chen. I'll be one of your hosts here today.
And I'm your co-host, Yousuf. And today we are here with Marzieh Sajjadi from the Education Department. Welcome, and how are you doing?
Thank you so much. My name is Marzieh Sajjadi, and I would be very happy to have an interview with you.
Awesome. So we want to know, how did you come to be interested in pursuing your master's in the education program, and what specifically is your research interest?
Actually, the program that nowadays I am studying, it is a course-based program. But as I always been interested into research, I wanted to do this research by my own, and this research is about the topic of my research is the experiences of women education graduates seeking a job in Ontario.
Nice.
Yeah, and it is related to somehow social sciences and also in education, because for this research I'm going to have interviews with some graduate students of education, and it is also about women.
Mm-hmm.
And how is the situation of women after they finish their studies.
So what is it about the experience of women who are looking for jobs after completing their education in education? What is it about this topic that attracts you to it?
I always in my life feel that there is something that always been in me that I wanted to study about women's rights, and I think that in comparison to men,
Mm-hmm.
the work and the work for women is providing less employment, and according to my some literature, women's work has always tended to be concentrated in a narrow set of occupations.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in Canada, the women's right is, and there is a law which is pay equity to
Mm-hmm.
women, but
Right.
Despite all these rules, there is always it is in some literature, in some researches, that people mentioned that there is always women's work has been undervaluated.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a woman, I think that I have to write something about it.
So despite the Pay Equity Act in Ontario, despite the
Yeah.
legislation giving some protection, there are still some worries, you say, and you
Yeah.
want to look deeper into it, specifically in education. And so in what kind of questions would you be asking in the interview, and how, what do you think would be the most relevant kinds of information that would be helpful to shed light on this issue for you?
This research that I have, it is a kind of case study, and in order to conduct this research, I'm going to interview some women about the job interviews that they had.
Oh, I
And
see.
yeah, and so I'm going to ask about that in the process of finding a job. Did they have an experience that they sense something that if they were a man, they could get that job or not? So I will give some women a set of questions, and so they are going to answer these questions, and I have to give the women I'm going to call these women and ask about what they experienced. And also I'm going to have I want to collect data by two different ways. One of them is by having a telephone conversation with them, and another one I am going to have a discussion so I can learn about these women.
Yeah, I guess that's really fascinating. I was wondering, in addition to interviewing women, would you also, for example, women, some men as well, just to see how their experiences actually differ from the kinds of lived experiences from women in seeking these jobs, and maybe find two different patterns given the gender differences or some other differences as well?
So I didn't get your question.
Oh, my question, sorry. My question was, in addition to interviewing women, would you also interview some men as well, just to see how their experiences kind of differ? That might shed some light on, to really hash out the differences.
Yeah, no, actually, my plan is some telephone interviews, and I also have a focus group interview.
Okay.
So some women who are graduated from education field are going to sit down by each other and share their experiences about what they had in the past. And so I am not going to make a conclusion out of what I am collecting, because my research is a qualitative research, and
Right.
I know that maybe I can't generalize my ideas into something big, but I am just going to describe what these women experienced in the past, and I hope that maybe this can be helpful.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So, Marzia, based on some of your research so far, some of the literature that you've looked at, can you tell us a little bit about what sorts of challenges or difficulties or perhaps discrimination women do face in something like the job search process?
Yeah, actually, it is mentioned that even some of my friends who are graduated recently from universities, they had some difficulties finding a job which is related to education field, and some of the literature will suggest that the women who are immigrants here have more difficulties even than the white-born Canadians.
Really?
Yeah, and but I am not going to deal with this problem. I am just comparing the chances of men and the chances of women. And the literature shows that there is there is a discrimination, but maybe this discrimination is not elaborated, and maybe they can't express it. In at the end of the job interviews, nobody say you that you are not getting a job because you are a woman.
Right.
Yeah, but
So,
I am just describing that what happened during this interview, and maybe I am going to show some statistics. Yeah.
So like you were saying, it's not just sort of overt, really obvious discrimination. No one's going to say that we're not going to hire you because you're a woman, but there's smaller things, maybe unconscious bias or many other issues that are standing in the way of sort of full equity in kind of the hiring process.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So how are you going to be selecting your participants for this sort of research?
Actually, as the legislations are different in different provinces of Canada, so I had to choose one province, and so I chose Ontario because it has some outstanding universities in the education field, and from the universities of Ontario, I choose the best ones in education. And so I am going to write down 2 universities and ask about some graduate students, some alumni, and I want to send them some emails, and if they are okay to have an interview with me, it would be perfect. And one of these universities is Western.
Awesome. So we're running out of time, but I guess I have one more question. So what are you roughly expecting in terms of results from the interviews, and how do you think your research will further expand based on those sort of results that you might think are likely? And do you have some future proposals as well, sort of expansions on the works that you're doing right now, for example?
So you're asking that for my future suggestion for other researchers?
Yeah, I mean, what are your future, what do you think you'll be doing in future as well after a few months, given that you might be able to have conducted some interviews, you might have some idea of what to expect from those interviews?
Yeah, actually, I am so interested about women studies, and also as my field is education, and so I like to expand it, and yeah, and I also want to study for PhD.
Awesome.
Yeah, I really like it, and so I want to do more researches with these subjects.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Marzia, for joining us and telling us about your work today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marzia.
Thanks.
Okay, this has been GradCast at the Western Research Forum. My name is Yimin, and I was joined with Yousuf. Our guest for the segment was Marzia Sadati.
Sajadi.
Sajadi.
Yeah.
Sajadi.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Yeah, have a great day.
This has been GradCast, the official radio show and podcast of the Society of Graduate Students at Western University. I've been your producer, Gavin Tolometti, and I was joined with hosts Yimin, Chen and Yousuf Hasan. If you would like to learn more about the show or become a guest, or maybe join the committee, you can email us at gradcastradio@gmail.com. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at GradCast Radio. You can also find select episodes on our YouTube channel at GradCast Radio. If you'd like to find more of our episodes online, you can go to our website, gradcast.ca, or you can go to iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you for listening, and have a great night.